and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, governments form or disintegrate across the world, across the centuries, whether hailing from a democratic system, whether it's a dictatorship, or even a monarchy. Now, the entire purpose of a government's existence is to commit to create a system founded in justice and peace, a system that protects its people. It protects the basic human rights and liberties of the masses. And for that, it is imperative that all groups of that society participate, especially those vulnerable, and at least have some representation to the systems of the government. Now, to discuss with us which governments across the world have historically succeeded, what form of governments have succeeded and delivered, and which haven't, and what are the reasons behind that. Let me introduce our guests here in the Lahore studio. We have with us Mr. Waqar Imam. Thank you for joining us. You've been the former Speaker of the National Assembly. And we have Dr. Ali Salim. You've got a PhD in state nationalism. You're also teaching currently. And with us on the line from Doha, we have a political analyst, Mr. Fidelis Mba. So let's start with you, Mr. Waqar Imam. We're talking about governance, and what defines good governance in your view?
Good governance or quality of governance depends on the overall spectrum that those who are have been through the vote legitimized to rule for a particular people or a government, and they have to basically, in accordance with law, deliver the basic problems, resolve the problems and deliver the requirements and needs of the people of the area that they govern. And in doing so, they have to have the monies to do it, which would be through reasonable taxation. And once the monies have been raised, then how they are expended and the methodology and the manner they are expended in different areas, and especially in, depends on Pakistan, for instance. Most of our budget goes on repayment of loans, followed by defense, followed by the administrative expenditure, and then followed by what we spend on the development of our people and their social requirements. So governance, in a way, and especially in Pakistan, is a very major challenge because we have 207 million people according to our last census, and GDP is not big, it's only $300 billion. And these four elements that I've just stated, debt repayment, defense expenditures, civil administration expenditure, and then what is left is spent on the welfare of the people. But even given those elements, the quality of how those service deliveries are given to the people in accordance with the statutes or the law is what ultimately defines the quality of governance. And in that manner, I think with the new government coming into power 4 or 5 months back, they have a very major challenge because the economic underpinnings, so the economic elements of our new government have been not very favorable. In fact, we have very major deficits on our fiscal accounts, and also we have a very major deficit on our imbalance of our export and imports. We have a $40 billion deficit last year, $60 billion of imports and only $22 billion of exports. So in order to do that, the new government had to find ways and means of raising monies from outside because our own revenues have not kept up pace with the requirements of our people. So this is why the debt has become such a major problem and a headache for those who govern Pakistan.
So economic underpinnings, as you highlighted, something which is an issue here in Pakistan in trying to get the government to deliver to the people. If we, Dr. Ali Salim, talk about it from a global perspective, especially historically, how much of this interferes in the government carrying out its duties, especially keeping in mind what scarce resources they do have to utilize?
So if we talk about historically, there is a major shift from government to governance. So government was top down from, there was a separate, structure who was delivering services and goods to the populace. Now, since 1990s, we have shifted to governance, which means that there are no top-down deliveries. It's a network. Everybody, civil society, media, government, populace, everybody has to, NGOs, they have to contribute if we have to improve the governance. So the governance, if we look at the economic issues, they have always been important. So whether we look at historically or today.
Right.
So if you don't have money, you can't do much. What is different historically is that in the 30s, 40s, people didn't expect much from the government. So if they were poor, they thought that was their fate. If they were unhealthy, they did something wrong. Now the issue is that because of this 24 hours news cycle and other things, people think that government should.
So the question of accountability comes up here.
Right.
It plays a really major role in trying to establish at least a good government. Here I'd like to welcome Mr. Fidelis.
For me, I feel good governance is good governance takes place when people are happy with the people they've chosen to pilot the affairs of either a country or a region or a state or a council. When people can express themselves the way they want, when people can hold the leaders accountable for their actions or decisions or policies, when people can move about freely, when people can sleep with their two eyes closed, when people can feed the way they want, they can wear the clothes they want to wear, and their children can go to school. People can actually more like realize their ambitions. That's when good governance is said to have taken place. Good governance is not when public officials lord themselves over the electorate, because in most cases you have people, especially public officials, when they're going seeking elective positions, you see them being very nice, relating with the people, eating with the people, talking with the people, go visiting them. And immediately they get into office, it becomes a different thing. They are no longer accessible. They can no longer speak to the people. They lord themselves. They become dictators. They become, people that you couldn't have even imagined that they would become, but because of public office. So for me, good governance is when people sacrificially actually get into positions and are able to use such opportunities to improve the situation of things before they moved into office or before they were elected. Because the reason for people giving you their mandate to get into a public office or nominating you is to improve their fortunes. So good governance can only be seen to have occurred when the people, you even surpass the expectation of people rather than disappointing them when you are given an opportunity to serve.
Right. So what we've established so far is one thing, for sure, every government success is based on whether they can deliver to the people and represent the people correctly. There are different variations to this, but also the government, the form of government itself, it plays a major role. What kind of governance is there in a certain country? Mr. Fakhr Imam, in your opinion, which system has been most effective? If we were to just talk about South Asia in general, do you think we can generalize, or is it unique for every country?
Well, because our heritage was the British, who were the people who colonized our areas, South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. We have inherited the British parliamentary system of government, these four countries. And by and large, they have continued with what was known as the Government of India Act 1935, which means a trichotomy of power between Parliament, the executive, and the judiciary, and now the media increasingly is playing a very major role. And in terms of parliamentary system of government, the essence of parliamentary system of government is that the government of the day is held accountable through the procedures and mechanisms in Parliament in particular, such as when you have the question hour and the ministers or the Prime Minister have to answer questions directly relating to what transpires within the country and on foreign relations as well. So that mechanism or method of parliamentary system makes the government very much accountable to what is actually going on. And in that sense, then over a period of time, through other parliamentary procedures and mechanisms, you can further highlight all the issues such as the requirements and basic needs of the citizens of the country, starting with their educational system, their health systems, and the kind of quality of life that they have. The environment has become a critical issue now. Clean water, the sewage systems, waste, mostly in urban areas, how they're managed, and then all the other requirements of keeping the country going, how your services industry is doing, how your industrial institutions are progressing, how your agroeconomic systems are working, and how they impact the needs and requirements of the citizen. Ultimately, the whole purpose is to raise the standard of living and the quality of life of the people.
Now, I'd like to welcome in esteemed guest, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Shahid Khaqan Abbasi. Thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. In your opinion, what are the key elements that determine what distinguishes good governance from bad?
Good governance or bad governance is based upon the performance of that particular government. I don't think it's really a systemic issue. You can have good governments in a parliamentary setup. You can have good governments in a presidential setup. There have even been good governments without democracy or limited democracy. So that really is the performance of the party or the person in power.
So if it depends on the performance, what would be the key elements if we are to look at maybe certain things like accountability, transparency, policies, agendas, and also the representation of the people and getting what they demand delivered?
Absolutely. It depends on how people view the performance of a government. In today's world, the performance is basically economic. If a government is able to deliver a strong economy for the people, if they prosper, if they have jobs, if they make more money, if there are more businesses, if the economy grows, then the people are happy. Of course, we have to look at the social aspects, the human rights issues. So it's a mix, and every government has to create a balance there. And almost every country in the world has, due to its own particular economic issues, its particular structural issues within the society and within the economy, it's handled it differently. And Pakistan is no exception.
Now, economic growth is also associated by experts as being directly related to a democratic setup. Now, do you agree with that?
Well, that is the traditional or the conventional viewpoint. But there are economies in the world which have not had democracy or not had democracy in the real sense, and they have prospered in economic sense. So it's really how what the socio-economic structure of that particular country is, what are the aspirations of the people, what is the structure of the makeup of the population. So there are many factors which contribute to how people view the government or how they view its performance or how it's able to deliver performance.
It's an interesting point of view because in the Western world, generally critics are very harsh on dictatorships. But there have been, in your opinion, maybe any dictatorships one could consider as benevolent dictatorships where the economy grew and the people were happy with a tenure of a leader that lasted more than 1 decade?
Well, as I said, it's really based upon each country's experience and its particular socio-economic structure. I mean, you take China. China did not have democracy. They had a very strong autocratic setup, but they moved to a limited form of democracy and they have prospered. And they are probably the most prosperous economy or the fastest growing economy in the history of the world. You can look at Taiwan, you can look at Korea, Singapore, where democracy has not been at the forefront in that sense. So it's really a question of what comes first. Does prosperity come first or does democracy come first? As I said, the conventional viewpoint is that you must have democracy before you're able to have a strong economy. But there are exceptions, there are very visible exceptions to that.
Right now, there are also criticisms of a democratic setup, especially when there are multi-parties involved, and especially when it comes to election campaigning. It is in some ways associated with how marketing takes place, where advertising companies try to hide the flaws of products by sloganeering or by fancy campaigns. And it's seen as a similarity how politicians also do it. Do you feel that this criticism is fair, or maybe this is just part and parcel of a democratic system trying to win the voters' appeal?
No, that is part of the democratic process. Of course, there are laws which are different in every country on how to limit the impact of money or the impact of other practices on the elections. So every country decides to put certain limits on how much money can be spent, how much media control there is, what is the availability to be on the media, and many other issues. So really, it's really particular to each country, but as a principle, it's part of the democratic process.
But it also, don't you feel that maybe it takes away from the real value of what representation of the people actually means, especially when campaigning comes out in sloganeering and promises that are never necessarily kept by those who then come into power on the basis of those campaigns?
That's the whole spirit of democracy. Let the people decide. The media can't decide. The media can only project, or a party can only project its viewpoint. The people decide whether they agree with that viewpoint or whether they believe in that viewpoint, and they make a choice. And if they make a bad choice, they suffer, and the next time, hopefully, they will make a better choice. So that is how democracy works.
Okay, fair enough. But another criticism is that when elected governments once they come into power, they complain at times that the reason why they can't meet their projections or their agendas is because the bureaucracy in power doesn't work in cohesion with them.
Bureaucracy is a tool. So if a government is not able to use that tool effectively, then they will suffer and they will not be able to deliver. So it's really the government in power, the party in power, the people in power who get votes from the people, and then they make promises of delivery, and if they're able to deliver, they will come back. So they really cannot blame their tools for their lack of performance.
But can those tools be beefed up with rules, laws, transparency and accountability to try and ensure that everyone follows it accordingly? And also, once this accountability process is also initiated, and this is something that we have seen across various governments around the world, there turns up this one big argument that this is political victimization. Do you feel like this is an ailment only seen in maybe third world countries, or is this not restricted to third world countries?
No, I don't believe in the concept of a third world country. That's a terminology that I think should not be used. But the reality is that there should be, the accountability process should be inherent in the democratic process. If it is separated and used to victimize the opposition, then it doesn't work. So it's a very delicate balance how the accountability takes place. So wherever it has happened, it is inherently built into the legal code and also the democratic and the practices of the institutions within the government.
Now, just one last question from you. Now, there are, of course, political parties and there are various different kind of governments that evolve with time and they mature. Could there be a possibility that a country that has seen a democratic process largely and wholly can evolve into something which merges in a welfare state? If we were to take Pakistan even as an example, would that be something that would maybe improve the process of governance? Or does it have to stick to its original form?
A welfare state is dependent on the policies of the government. How much money do they have? How do they want to spend that money? So that really has nothing to do with the democratic process. There are welfare states who protect their citizens from cradle to grave and are not democracies. There are other democracies where people are left to the market forces. The US is a big example where the welfare system is very, very limited, and the people are inherently open to the variances in the market system. So it's really dependent on each country, what experiences do they have. For example, Pakistan has had a variety of experiences with different models of government. I think we've tried almost every existing format of government in the world. And we've seen the pros and cons of each government. So I think Pakistan is today on the right track with parliamentary democracy. And I believe that for us, this is the only system that will work.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Khaqan Abbasi. Thank you for joining us here on Newswire. We have to take a quick short break here. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. Talking today, we are highlighting issues that a good government would face. What kinds of governments are out there in the world today that are succeeding? What are the kinds that are failing? And on the line, we have one of our guests, Mr. Fidelis. Let me ask you this, especially in light of what has happened in different Arab countries. We have seen dictatorships going on for way too long, a lot of unhappy people, a lot of protests, and then the toppling down of governments. In light of that, you mentioned that, yes, it is imperative that the will of the people, the basic rights of the people are met. But is there something to learn from that? Is it a key factor that the kind of government in play in a certain nation determines whether it will be successful or not?
Well, in most cases, across the world, there's still different democracies or different style of governance that are peculiar, especially when governance is mixed with culture. Like in the Middle East, where monarchy is still like the mainstay of their governance, it works for them because this is something that they've passed on from generation to generation. But in other climes across the world, like in Africa, for instance, it's difficult to really have this system of governance in Africa or even in Europe, where people are more open-minded. People don't really abide by cultural rules any longer, because outside of the Gulf or the Middle East, people are more vocal. People are no longer following cultural practices which have been there for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. But like I try to advocate. For me, I feel the parliamentary system of governance actually is key in terms of ensuring and guaranteeing good governance, because it gives the people that opportunity to be able to select their representative and to be heard. Because under a presidential system of governance, one person is making all the rules and decides when he wakes up, he decides what he wants to do or what he doesn't want to do. But under a parliamentary system of governance, you see the people actually give their mandate to their representative, and it's a case of decisions being taken not just unanimously, but you have to actually lobby people from other regions or other constituencies to be able to agree with you. There's a whole lot of debate, and it gives room for constituencies or regions to be able to have their say, unlike a presidential system or a monarchy where a decision is just passed on, and in most cases, there's no form of objection. There's not even room for objection. But under a parliamentary system of government where the people's vote counts in terms of constituencies, their representatives would have to veto a particular action before it becomes a law. So, and that also gives room for governance to trickle down to the grassroots, where if you're the representative, you have to go back to your constituency to consult them before you take a decision or before you cast a vote for a particular policy. And the people can ask you questions and hold you accountable because you're closer to them. But when it's a monarchy or when it's a presidential system of governance, one person is at the top and just very few people actually have access to that individual.
All right. And Dr. Ali Salim, let me ask you this. As you heard, Mr. Fidelis, his preference is for a parliamentary form of government that seems to give more power to the people, more representation, and also more accountability on part of those who are leading it. What, in your opinion, is a more successful form of government if we were to just take a very general view of it, not specific to any geographical area?
Okay. So, I think that the problem of democracy are, have to be solved, and they are going to be there, even if whatever system we have. So, if we have parliamentary system, even then the parliament, the issue of authoritarianism or lack of popular sovereignty or military intervention, these will always be there. For example, in South Asia, we have, at least in Pakistan and Bangladesh, we have military intervention similar with the parliamentary system. If we look at Latin America, so they followed the American tradition. We follow the Westminster British tradition, as Mr. Fakhr Imam said. So they followed the American tradition. They thought that if we followed the American model, we will succeed as the US succeeded. Now, US constitution is there for, more than 200 years. But the Latin American constitutions have gone, Haiti, for example, has more than 17 constitutions, and most of them were presidential form of government following the US model. So the issue is not really, the bigger issue is not really what form of government you have, because you have presidential form of government being successful in France, in the US, in other countries, and then you have parliamentary system working very well in Canada and Australia and of course the United Kingdom. The issue is that whether the leaders are willing to give the rights to the people, whether you have the kind of political sagacity of looking at the problems and how to solve them, and whether you have the money, of course, to deliver to the people. So these are the issues we have to solve first. If you can't solve these issues, whether you have parliamentary system or presidential system, that is
There's
not
no one perfect formula.
Right.
You mentioned the economic reasons being a
Right.
very big underpinning in whether they succeed or not. But is there maybe a difference in society, in culture, in a political maturity, like you mentioned, political sagacity in a certain community, but also what the historical context of that region is, of those people are, that determines what kind of government will take place and be able to deliver?
Yes, the culture, the society, the history, sociology, and the norms and values that a society believes in ultimately determine, I think, much of how they govern themselves or are governed. And I agree with a colleague here that it's the methodology that really works. In the democratic systems of government around the world, there are two classic systems. One is the British Westminster model, the other is the American system of government, where the president and the Congress are separately elected, but they have a correlation through the Constitution itself, how it's evolved in the last 240 years. The British parliamentary system in Britain doesn't even have a written constitution. It goes by statute law and it goes by convention and tradition. And it's held up till this day, except that now Scotland wanted to separate a few years ago. It didn't succeed, 45. Today they have voted to go out of the European Union through Brexit. Now, but this is the will of the people of that country, how they actually go about it. And what determines a normative form of a responsible democratic government is how they change government. And it's through fair, free, transparent elections when governments are changed that strengthens the institution, strengthens the people themselves, because in that manner they're able to ask the relevant authorities in a legitimate form how and why they are not being governed according to the principles on which the government itself got elected. So in that way you have no perfect system in the world so far. But you have better and worse systems. And in an authoritarian system, by and large, except that we've had one-party systems in what was the Soviet Union and Russia today, by and large, It's one party, the Communist Party of those countries, China. And China has been extraordinarily successful. But within, I think, that party, they probably have democracy within the Politburo, within the Presidium, within the parties that operate. There is accountability in that sense. So they have one-party systems with accountability within the system itself. On the other hand, the parliamentary form of government or the presidential form, as they are known outside, they have, more perhaps outside. You can see how their checks and balances are working. So in that way, and China has been extraordinarily successful in transforming 700 to 800 million out of the poverty cycle in just 4 years. And it was Mr. Deng Xiaoping who was the key motivator in transforming modern China from a country which, was not doing well at all.
Right.
And 3 other presidents who've come since his going away in the 1990s. He's had 3 presidents, and Mr. Xi is the third. And they have continued with that success story. And they had spectacular growth rates of 10 to 13%. Today, their growth rate is more like 6 to 7%. But still, given that they are $14 trillion economy, America is number 1 at $22, $23 trillion. They are far ahead of the third, which is Japan, $6 trillion. Germany is the fourth at $4.5 trillion. And then you have India, which has come in as number 5. And then you have France. You have Britain at $2.8 trillion economies, and then you have Italy at 2.3. Right. And then you have Canada and Republic of Korea and these other countries. We are far behind. We are $0.3 trillion.
Not even
and so in that sense, there are other countries like Singapore, which have done extraordinarily well, although they're very small, because of good governance. This is the key. You see, the way they have transcended from poverty-ridden countries to countries which have excelled and which are now matching the North American and European countries and Japan.
And neither of these examples, like for example, you spoke of Singapore, you spoke of China, they're not defined by a democratic system, are they?
No, so not in the classic sense.
Not in the classic sense, which is an interesting juxtaposition, because in general, universally, in a lot of capitalistic economic societies, this is what experts are relating to. There's an economic growth, there is a democratic system, hence those two are related. So Mr. Fidelis, let me ask you this. What, in your view, especially if we are to take in context of what governments are like in Africa, is it a true and a fair interrelation between that? If there is a democratic system, you see economic growth, you see more literacy levels, and hence you see a happier nation.
Well, for me, good governance is key, because the policies you put in place would determine either the growth of the country's economy or its downfall. Countries under sanction, like Korea, Sudan, and other countries, are suffering either because of dictatorship on the part of the leaders, which is bringing about sanctions, which is bringing about a slow growth, not encouraging investors to come into that country, and also discouraging businesses from flourishing. But if a good governance is in place in a particular country, and the laws actually encourage businesses to thrive, that's when the economy would start to grow or keep growing. Because if you have a place where the laws of the country are not protective of business interests, no investor from any part of the world will want to put his money in any country where there's a policy somersault, which is where countries make laws, and the next day another government comes and it changes, another government comes and it changes. Because of that instability in terms of governance, many investors would not want to come in. People won't want to do business with you. Even countries won't want to.
So stronger policies. You're highlighting the importance of stronger policies, a government with an agenda, and then revisiting policies maybe that don't work.
Well, the thing is, I'm a very strong advocate of parliamentary system of government, where checks and balances do exist. It's not an individual decision. That's why I have been advocating for parliamentary system, because when you know that the system actually is protective of business interests and policies, Even if you have a dictatorial agenda, when you get in, the system will check you, will put you in check, and you will be able to destabilize the system. Some of the flourishing economies and democracies, if you look at it, most of the big economies of this world, apart from maybe China, are actually having a very democratic system of government that encourages rule of law, that encourages protection of business interests. China is flourishing not because really of democracy, because if you talk about democracy in China, it's still debatable as to whether they're actually practicing good democracy. But again, they've had a consistent system which encourages stability across board. If they have a law that protects it's A, whether it doesn't matter who comes into office. So the communist system has worked for them. They've made it in such a way that it's very effective. But in some other countries where you have either the military coming in between to overthrow a civilian government, or where every president that comes in comes with a different agenda, removing people from office, just appointing the people they like, in that sense, it makes it very difficult. There's no consistency. So if the laws are actually there to protect business interests, economy will flourish. It doesn't matter who is there, right, whether the person is a true Democrat or not, as long as the laws are consistent.
Right, the laws are consistent. And Dr. Ali Salim, that's interesting. He mentions that what we're seeing again in this conversation is that the basis, the foundation of any successful government is accountability, strong laws, transparencies, getting the voice of the people to the leaders and back. But also what's interesting to note is that you quoted an example of Singapore, there's China also, where Singapore was an agrarian, largely country in economy. It was doing really badly until one specific leader came in and just established a very set rules. So is this something, when we look at democratic systems, we see different politicians in power, we see a lot of mudslinging going on. That's another aspect of interfering in good governance. How big a role does this play, especially in South Asia, where there are parliamentary form of governments? If you're just looking at Pakistan, doesn't it interfere in the effectiveness of establishing or following policies and agenda?
So I think we have to recognize that the different elements of good governance, which we are different definitions which we have, are sometimes trade-offs. So when you think of efficiency and effectiveness and consistency, wouldn't it be better to have a dictator for 20 years, like Taiwan had, like South Korea had, like different Chinese model you have? So like Suharto, who remained for 30 years. And then there is the democratic system, which is inclusive, which is participatory, which is looking equitable, and all these different adjectives which we use. But we have to recognize that democracies are messy. Democracies are not, one clear direction with one consistent policies. Democratic leaders have to think of other people. They have to think of their cabinet. They have to think of their parties, which are not always, thinking in the same way. They have to think of, in federations, they have to think of provinces. So Imran Khan or any other prime minister of Pakistan cannot really put one policy in all of Pakistan. He has to think of provincial governments. He has to think of other different communities in multilingual, in multi-ethnic societies like us. We have to think of all these things. So democracies are always messy. They are not as effective, as consistent as dictatorships. And you have the whole South Asian miracle which we see, and most of these miracles is based on dictatorships or one-man rule, giving policies and coming up with agendas and consistent policies, which the investors like, of course. And but of course they are not inclusive. So we have to see that this trade-off. So which way we want to go? We want to go, and of course not all dictatorships are are consistent. We have to recognize we also have dictatorships, and they haven't done much good to us.
I saw you smiling at the idea of possible 20 years of dictatorship might be a better option than a messy democracy. What's your view?
Well, I don't know. In Pakistan, unfortunately, most of our systems have not delivered the way they should have delivered. And one of the reasons, I think, is that the value system of those who were governing was not up to the mark of, say, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who spoke in terms of giving this country a kind of total level of integrity and honesty. I think this has been one of our major misfortunes of this country, that we've not measured up to the standards with which Pakistan was created. And we've had many opportunities, and we've had many missed opportunities. And in 70 years is a long time for an emerging country, and we've been bypassed by many countries which did not have the potential and promise that Pakistan had. I mean, I think we have not invested enough in our human resource, in the sense that the quality of education we have imparted to our youth and our children. And then, investments. Where do investments go worldwide? They go where monies are secure. They can be secure in a democratic country. They can be secure in a not so democratic country. And where people bring in their monies, after all, they have opportunity to invest anywhere in the world. Why were they investing in China? Because the Chinese government made sure that those investments had the opportunity to create further monies, and then whatever were the genuine profits would be allowed to be fairly remitted through their normal banking systems. This is where the monies go. At one time they were going to Europe, other times they were going to Japan, in North America at one time, now they're going to China, even to our neighbor India, and then to these Far Eastern countries. Why a small place like Singapore? Singapore was just a port. All the monies they had was ships docking in. That's all the monies. Because they're so small, they had virtually no agriculture. And they have transformed themselves into a hub of a financial center, which can, compete with the top there, whether it was Hong Kong, whether it was Taipei, whether it's Beijing, whether it's Shanghai, whether it's Tokyo. So people go there because of the quality of services they have.
Mr. Fidelis, let me ask you this. We're talking about how governments are also, not just these being the key issues in making sure that they are able to deliver, their institutions is strong, education is better, but also governments are heard often complaining that the bureaucracy is the reason behind the implementation of these agendas not taking place. Do you think that's a fair assessment or a fair complaint?
One of the things actually left out earlier was the fact that if you have an educated populace, if you have a higher percentage of your country actually so engaged in business, either IT or anything, and not just relying on handouts from government, that goes a long way in trying to ensure that the economy grows and continues to grow. Like we keep referencing Singapore, we keep referencing China and the US. Almost everybody there has some level of education, at least above average. Most of them are not relying on government for handouts. Most of them are not relying on government for jobs. Most of them can do things, especially for countries with population, like your country, Pakistan, like my country, Nigeria, some other countries with population. As long as the institutions are strengthened and the population is given the required education for people to work independent of government, for people to embrace technology, it goes a long way in trying to strengthen the business environment. It also goes a long way in giving people different options to be able to generate revenue and not just the one-way traffic. IT in the world, anywhere in the world, if you're proficient in IT, you can work anywhere. You can do any kind of business you want to do. But a situation where the populace is still being left behind with little or no education and just a few people educated and also in government, and then making those people who they only need them when it comes to votes. All they need is just to perpetually keep a larger population of the country uneducated and then relying on them for votes during election. That would only work for some time. It wouldn't work for a long time. So if a country wants to move forward, any country that wants to dominate in the future has to now make education a vital component of its policies, because an educated population would help in terms of like opening up the market for people to either do business in that country or be able to also go outside and be able to attract investments back into the country. Good governance starts with when you actually empower the people and not just making the people tools that you can use for politics. That's only when you want to go for campaigns, and which is why you see in most cases, when the population is not educated, you see the same set of people being recycled in governance and in public office. You see the same set of people being the ones actually controlling the economy. So if whether they are doing well or not, there's no room for improvement, because the others who would have actually come to challenge the system are held down perpetually. So education is key. I really support that suggestion by the guest that if you educate the populace, the country's business climate would change for the better.
The business environment change for the better. And this again brings us back to the same position. Accountability is given so much importance, but it also brings in this debate about how much of it is political victimization and how much is it actually a demand for transparency. Whether we're talking about Pakistan, especially in the current scenario, or we're talking about other countries around the world, do you feel like this is something more specific to third world countries, this problem?
If you take out the developed world, rest of the accountability is more like political victimization. So, but of course, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't have accountability. So accountability should be there, but accountability has to be fair. So if it's not fair and it's not all across, and you are saving yourself, for example, if we were talking about bureaucracy, right? Mm-hmm. So whenever a martial law or a new government comes, they remove the bureaucrats and they come up with a new crop of bureaucrats. So this government has done it, previous government has done it, Musharraf did it, so everybody does it. What happens? Nothing much happens. So the new crop comes up. Unless you change the system, unless you change the, so in economics we talk of incentives. So unless you change the incentive system, whether it's in politics, whether it's in bureaucracy, corruption will not end. So you will have to show the people that if you are fair, if you are honest, you are going to move ahead. And if you take a shortcut, you are going to lose. In this country, for the last 70 years, what we have seen that those who have taken shortcuts have moved ahead. Those who have tried to play by the rules have lost. So if you look at the bureaucrats, those who have connections with the politicians, they get good postings.
But how do you give better incentives? How do you give incentives that bring them in line?
So I am an ex-bureaucrat, so I can tell you that if you want to give good incentives, you have to, for example, everybody knows that if there is a security of tenure, and I think the Insaf government has talked about it, previous government has also talked about it, people or bureaucrats can work there, they can understand an area, they can work on it, and they can, work for the betterment of the people.
But that's also counterproductive, isn't it? Would you say that there is a downside of having a secure job in the government, knowing that no matter what you do, you're really not going to lose it? If we're talking about job security, like as he mentioned,
no, I'm
with regards to incentives.
Security of tenure in one posting,
right,
for 3 years or 2 years.
Well, I think in Pakistan, the permanent civil service, as it's called, is based on the old Indian civil service system, which used to be called the steel framework of the British Raj, which actually administered over 200 centuries what the British Empire or British Raj of that time, how they evolved. In Pakistan, we have followed the same system, as has Singapore. Singapore has the same civil service even today. The only difference is that in Singapore, they were able to administer and govern. Previously, we used to use the word administration, now we use the word governance, but it's interlinked. The administrative element is like governance. And in Pakistan, for some reasons, our people who were governing or administering our country, in fact, did not adhere to norms and values, which means rule of law, in the same way that Singapore did, in my opinion. And in fact, if I had had a long conversation with the person who changed Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, and one of the reasons he says, I'm surprised that with the civil services you had, why isn't that you didn't do better? And the reason was simple. The reason is they did not adhere to the norms and values they should have done. And security of tenure could be one reason, because in 1972-73 Constitution, the constitutional cover that the civil servants had, they don't have. The Indians still do that. But that's only one element. I think, by and large, there was this kind of an environment where when you did not adhere to these norms and values, not always did you get the right results. This is unfortunate, and this had much to do with the people who are actually governing at the top of the country. So in that sense, we need, as I said earlier, we need that kind of sense of dignity, of having integrity, honesty, which then impacts overall the environment, and you create that kind of an environment where people who perform well are the ones who are actually rewarded. And that is which should happen normally.
Right.
In Pakistan, this has not automatically happened. And I think this is where we've been let down.
And Fidelis, if I could get very quickly the closing remarks from you on how big a role do incentives play in determining whether good governance actually takes place?
For me, the incentive you can give the people is for good governance to be actually enshrined is when you eliminate corruption, when you make the public office less attractive for people who want to enrich themselves. That's, I think, the best incentive, because it now encourages those who actually genuinely want to serve, those who have the qualities to be able to deliver service, will now get into office, and they know they're accountable to the people. They know that they're not going to corruptly enrich themselves. That's the greatest incentive. And then when you educate the people to know their rights and also to be independent of living off, rather than living off handouts from public office holders.
And Dr. Ali Salim, from you, your closing remarks on finally trying to determine what else really will push a government to perform the way it should for its people.
So I would again reiterate that, we have to manipulate and reorient the incentive system. So as, Mr. Farhar Imam said, that we have to, good guys have to succeed. So if the good guys don't succeed and the bad guys or the corrupt guys succeed, then of course, there is no hope.
Right.
So we have to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali Salim, Mr. Farhar Imam, and Fidelis joining us from Doha. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. We have to wrap up. You've been watching Newswire. Till tomorrow, goodbye.